so much, Evan. Yes, friends, I'm very happy to introduce this second panel for the day. We call it Colombian Spotlight, and it's called like that because we had a fourth meeting last year in Bogota at Javeriana University, supported by Confama, by our neuroscience department at the Faculty of Medicine, our friends at Los Andes University, and UNDP Colombia, and many other sponsors and friends from Neuropaz. And the good thing that we're bringing this panel now is because President Santos was talking about the hardships of, fighting a war in order to make peace, then building peace, and then seeing that peace being eroded because many things are happening now. But I want to introduce the audience to two magnificent humans that I have the pleasure to have met and to follow and to, hopefully collaborate more in the future. But we had a wonderful meeting, an event on 2025 in November in Bogota to start this and to prepare for this event that's happening now. So I want to introduce two scientists, two Colombian scientists. First, Felipe de Brigard is a professor in the departments of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience at Duke University. He's the principal investigator of the Imagination and Model Cognition Laboratory within the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences. And before Duke, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Cognitive Neuroscience of Memory Lab and the Center for Brain Science at Harvard University. He earned a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MA from Tufts University. His latest book is Memory and Remembering. And we are going to have also Andrés Moya. He's an associate professor of economics at the University at Los Andes University, Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. He's also the director of a wonderful project that's called Semillas de Apego, Seeds of Attachment, a community-based psychosocial program for caregivers of young children in communities affected by conflict and forced displacement, and commissioner for the 2024-2025 Lancet Commission on Health, Conflict, and Forced Displacement. His research focuses on understanding the consequences of conflict and forced displacement and how they thrust people into poverty through economic, psychological, and behavioral channels. He designs interventions to mitigate these consequences and foster movements out of poverty. He earned his PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of California, Davis. So, colleagues, it's a pleasure to have you today. Thank you for your generosity throughout last year and this year. And we're so happy to finally be here, given all of your generosity again to help make this moment happen. So, again, welcome. And let's start a conversation. I'm going to start with, sorry, we have two presentations before.
Yeah.
I'm on system one here, sorry. So let's breathe and stop now. So we're going to start with Felipe. Felipe, welcome and please go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay. So let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, super. So thanks very much, Andres, and hi, Andres. It's good to see you all. So today I want to tell you a little bit about a project that we have been doing for the past 5 years in Montes de Maria. I like to say that I have been interested on memory for as long as I can remember. I have a lab here at Duke, started off 13 years ago. And one of the things that I really, really like about memory is the fact that it is constructive and that actually we can modify our memories at the time, particularly at the time of retrieval. One of the lines of research that we have been doing in the lab consists precisely in trying to understand how you can modify aspects of an autobiographical memory when you remember it. So, for instance, suppose that there is this person that experiences having had an ice cream, and later on at retrieval, she remembers this experience of having had an ice cream. What we study, what people are interested in on the modification of memory at retrieval study, is how the process of remembering this event influences the original memory of the event. Now, in our lab, we do something similar, but with a twist. We're interested on how exactly imagining alternative ways in which past events could have occurred might influence the content of the original memory. So again, suppose that you have an experience, say, of having an ice cream, and then later on at retrieval, what you do is not exactly retrieve exactly the event as it happened, but sometimes you might imagine how things could have been different. So for instance, you might imagine, oh man, imagine if that I had lost that ice cream, that I wouldn't have had that experience. And then you have a particular sort of feeling when that occurs. Or you might imagine, oh man, that ice cream was good. I should have gotten 3 balls instead of just the one. These kinds of thoughts that we call episodic counterfactual thoughts can influence the way in which the affect of the original memory is later on encoded again and retrieved. In particular, what we have noticed is that when you imagine alternative ways that are better, you tend to feel regret, which is a negative memory, a negative emotion that tends to heighten the negative emotion of the original memory. By contrast, when you imagine worse ways in which the event could have happened, you actually feel relief at the way in which things actually turned out. And that positive feeling tends to influence the original memory. We did a lot of work with these ideas in mind on individuals with generalized anxiety and depression. And we have found that some of the strategies that we have employed, what we call emotional reappraisal strategies involving imagination, are oftentimes even better than some cognitive behavioral therapies that have been used, by clinicians and so forth. So the key ideas that I wanted to have at this point is that we actually constantly use our imagination to modify the emotional content of our previous experiences so that we can cope with the past more easily. We call that sometimes the coming to grips with the past effect. And in fact, a lot of the work that we have been doing in the lab suggests that we can use this sort of imagination, this kind of counterfactual thoughts, as psychological strategies to emotionally reappraise past experiences during memory reactivation. Now, about 6 years ago, I started to think that maybe forgiveness is also supported by a similar cognitive process. Might it be possible that when we forgive, we're actually reappraising the original negative valence of a negative event in order to help us to cope with it? So to pursue this idea, I started off a collaboration with a bunch of researchers, including philosopher Santiago Amaya, who back then was at the Universidad de los Andes and right now is at Rice, Paula Wittbold, who is involved with the Universidad Tecnológica de Bolívar, and with the Center for Historic Memory in Montes de Maria, with Wilson Lopez, a psychologist, a peace psychologist working at Universidad Javeriana, Kevin Labar, my colleague here at Duke University, and Lucy Elias, a philosopher who's half-time at Johns Hopkins and half-time at University in South Africa. So with this sort of idea in mind that maybe forgiveness involves the emotional reappraisal of past negative autobiographical memories, specifically memories of wrongdoings, we decided to set up an experimental project in Montes de Maria in the north of Colombia, one of the areas that was most affected by the violence, both from the guerrillas and the paramilitaries. And we were interested on studying the process of forgiveness and of remembering in victims of the conflict. So we applied for this grant, and on March the 30th of 2021, we've got it from the generous funding of the John Templeton Foundation. And I set up to organize an even larger group. One of the things that it was very, very important for me is that the group of researchers was actually from the community. So not only people here at the university, but particularly people from the community, including, of course, my amazing graduate student, Gabriela Fernandez, who has been sort of the heart of this project. So we assembled a great team, most of them, as I mentioned, researchers from the community. And the initial objective of that study that we actually is still ongoing, we finished data collection just 3 months ago, is basically to test the hypothesis as to whether forgiveness is associated with a reduction in the details of the episode. In other words, if it is associated with forgiveness, with forgetting of the episodes or the details of the episodes, or if forgiveness is just associated with a reduction in the affect, in the negative affect, but that there is no associated uh, forgetting of the episodes. We call the first hypothesis the episodic fading account, namely that the idea is that forgiveness involves both the reduction of how well we remember the event and also reduction in the affect. Or the alternative is the emotional fading account that suggests that both forgiven and non-forgiven wrongdoings are equally well remembered, that the only difference is in the affect. We have done this study using a variety of research methods, from interviews to questionnaires, and also we set up the first biophysiological study at the Universidad Tecnológica de Bolívar, so we can also record biophysiological responses from the body of the participants. And one of our first results actually just came out a few months ago with the community here in the United States, showing that that in fact there doesn't appear to be any kind of forgetting of the episodic details of the past wrongdoings. That in reality, all that seems to be changing is the affect with which we remember those wrongdoings. So, sort of giving credence to the famous motto of the victims of Colombia, we forgive, but we don't forget. So what are the next steps? What we have done so far in the past 5 years is, in a sense, is a proof of concept. We gather sufficient and interesting evidence to the effect that forgiveness is associated with the reduction of negative affect at retrieval, but not with the forgetting of the episodic details. What are we doing now? Well, we are trying to see if we can use emotional reappraisal strategies to increase the likelihood that victims might forgive the perpetrators. What do we plan to do after what we're doing right now? We hope to replicate our approach actually in other regions of Colombia and perhaps in other regions of the world. I want to end by asking this question: why do we explore peace scientifically in Colombia? I have been working in the United States for over 23 years now, I think. I have been doing a lot of research here using a variety of methods. Why did I want to do it in Colombia? Well, in part because I'm Colombian, in part too because, as you might have imagined, I too was inspired by the peace process, and I too was inspired to try to go back to my country and do things that could improve and continue the wonderful work that President Santos and his team have done. But of course, I also was interested in the papers. Now, one thing that is important to keep in mind when we do science is that the only output of science and of our scientific process is not really just the papers. Perhaps the most important output of scientific process is people. We also, as scientists, work with people. What do I mean by that? Let me just tell you briefly, we all know, and this is no lie, that research and development in Colombia is extraordinarily low. This is in comparison with other countries and the amount of money invested in research and development as a share of the GDP. Even when we compare it with countries that have similar GDP as we do, Colombia actually is really, really low relative to all of them. Even when we compare it with other countries in Latin America whose GDP is actually lower than Colombia, Colombia still goes really, really low in the amount of investment in research and development. Now, when you ask why is there so little research and development in Colombia, typically the answer is that there is little investment in research and development because there is little investment in education. And yes, we shouldn't be blind to the fact that the level of education in Colombia relative to other countries is extraordinarily low, particularly when it comes to tertiary education, that is to say, people that finish college. There is these days I have been seeing on Facebook this image that is coming around, and you can see that Colombia is pretty low in terms of attainment and education levels. But we also know that the more education a person has, the higher their salary and the lower the risk of unemployment. Here is from the OECD, some images that I plotted showing how when you reduce the unemployment, you have tertiary education. And in Colombia, those numbers are still pretty bad. When you look at the salary gap in general countries in the OECD, when they don't finish high school, they have typically less than they earn 17% less than the average. In Colombia, that was actually 30%. Um, Most countries, once they finish college, they have an earning potential of more than 54% relative to the average. In Colombia, that is multiplied by 150%. So finishing, there is a lot of unemployment people in tertiary education, and those that are employed tend to earn way more than the average. So my suggestion is that I think we need to reverse the investment logic. Instead of thinking that there is less investment in research and development in Colombia because there is a lower level of education, we should consider that there is a lower level of education because there is less investment in research and development. So when you think about a project like the project that I have been doing, and you think that many of the participants in that project are members from Colombia and are members of the community, you can see that participating in this project is about $300,000 what we invested. Participating in this project meant that a subset of these people finished their tertiary education. Some of them actually went on to doing a master's in the Universidad de los Andes, and some of them are applying to do a PhD. So doing science increases higher earning potentials. It lowers the probability of unemployment, and you can think of all the money that is also involved in the community itself. We know very clearly that there is a strong correlation between the lack of economic opportunities, high youth unemployment, and the persistence of violence in the armed conflicts in Monte de Maria. So I think that investment in research and development yields educational and economic benefits for the community. My suggestion for you to end up with is that investment in research and development could help to break the cycle of violence, unemployment, and lack of education. Doing science of peace can actually help with building peace. So with that, I want to end, and I want to thank you all. There is some more information about the project right there.
Thank you, Felipe, for this fantastic talk, and especially for your contribution to field research in Colombia using neuroscientific methods, but especially for that last reflection on how building peace is doing investments in development and local communities. Going back to what President Santos was saying, is basically the same idea that Emil Bruno was telling us at some point in his work, and is that, the powerful people sign the agreements, right? They sit down at the table, but it's the communities who have the burden of building this peace, and we can help them through science and investments to change those life trajectories, right? And now that we're talking about development and life trajectories, I want to introduce again Professor Andrés Moya from Los Andes University. Thank you, Andrés, for the work you do with your team. Thank you for this lovely and incredible project that is Semillas de Apego. And, basically to understand that also investing in these early years can really, as Felipe was saying, help to break the cycle of violence in a country that suffers of violence structurally. So, Professor Moya, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Andres. Very grateful for being here, and thank you also, Felipe, for sharing the stage with me. So let me share a little bit of our work on promoting caregiver mental health and early child development in these conflict-affected settings. I think maybe as you mentioned at the beginning in the introductions, I'm an economist, and most of my work has been trying to focus on the ways in which forced displacement in Colombia has been driving people into poverty and keeping them in chronic poverty. And I think maybe connecting to what President Santos was mentioning, a lot of my work has been inspired by talking to the victims. So back in 2005, we started our work with Ana Maria Ibanez, and then kind of realized that there was a huge mental health problem and issue that was not being addressed. And we started thinking how to connect mental health and if it can drive communities and people into poverty. And then over time, as I was doing my PhD, my field work for my PhD dissertation, I also started talking, and I was running all over the country, running lab experiments and talking to communities, talking to victims, and then also starting to learn about their lives and coming across the importance of mental health for early childhood development. So I don't need to say this, but this is just to put it there. We have experienced protracted conflict. We have decades of conflict, a peace agreement that we had high hopes for, but then because of pettiness, challenges, it has kind of run off the rails. But still, conflict is happening. We have 9.3 million people that have been victimized and legally recognized as victims in the country. This includes almost 8.5 million internally displaced persons. On top of that, we're the largest host of Venezuelan forced migrants, almost 3 million that have been migrating since 2016. And I think this creates a lot of challenges for Colombia. But one of those, and the one I want to focus on, is what's happening with young children. Right now, 1 out of every 4 children under the age of 5 is being born, is growing up in conflict-affected settings. And when we started to think about this, there was not much evidence, there was not much literature in terms of what does it mean to grow up? What does it mean to be born in this context of conflict and forced displacement? So in just one study that we conducted with Tatiana Heater, who was a PhD student right now at UC Davis, Sandra Rosso, who is an economist in the World Bank, we conducted this representative survey in Medellin, assessing the developmental gaps between the children of families born in displaced families and non-displaced children. And what you can see here is that there's large gaps in cognitive development, physical development, but especially large gaps in social-emotional development, high incidence of anxiety, depression, and mental health problems among the children being born in displaced families. And this is striking by itself, but it's even more striking because many of these children were not born when displacement happened. They didn't experience displacement by themselves. They actually were born many years later, and still they're experiencing kind of the mental health consequences and the developmental consequences of displacement. So this is just highlighting the intergenerational transmission of trauma and poverty. And so we can think about different mechanisms. Maybe in economics, we can think about extreme poverty, deprivation, access to services, and so on. But I want to highlight here is the role of caregiver mental health in being one of those main mechanisms. What do we know about the science of early childhood development? Well, early childhood is the most magical, important moment of our lives, is when the brain is more plastic. There's rapid brain development, 1 million neuronal connections per second. But at the same time is the period that's the most sensitive to adversities. And so when young children are exposed to systematic, persistent adversities, like the one that conflict, displacement bring, and when they don't have sensitive caregiving, this triggers the overactivation of different biological systems. This is commonly referred to toxic stress. And as you can see in the picture on the right, this is going to affect brain architecture, this is going to affect skill acquisition, this is going to affect physical and mental health, and this is going to have life-altering effects. So the experiences that children are going through in their early age are affecting their capacity to live productive, healthy, and happy lives. And this has consequences for them by themselves, for the family, but it's, in some sense, it's society that it's failing here. Now, we know that there's kind of this natural antidote, and the capacity of a caregiver to connect, to read the emotions, to provide this sensitive caregiving can buffer the physiological effects of stress. And so many parenting programs, actually the most successful parenting programs worldwide, the most important ingredient of this program and these programs is actually promoting this sensitive caregiving. And so this seems to provide kind of a natural antidote here. If we can provide this sensitive caregiving, then children can be buffered from these adversities, and maybe they can grow up closing those gaps. But as I mentioned, being in the field, talking to the victims, talking to the displaced populations, noticing very harsh parenting, a lot of physical, verbal violence, it kind of made me wonder, are we asking too much of caregivers? Are we asking too much when they're also going through trauma, adversities, hardships, and we expect them to be able to overcome all of this and connect with their children in a sensitive and caring way? So let me just provide some data that is going to picture how mental health is going to disrupt this capacity. And this comes from harmonized data from almost a sample of 5,000 caregivers from our different impact evaluations. And so this first figure is just plotting the dose-response relationship between the severity of conflict and mental health. And what you're seeing here is that the exposure to more severe violence, measured here by more number of violent events, is actually hindering and it's affecting caregiver mental health. Then caregiver mental health is going to affect and it's going to hinder the capacity to connect with children in a sensitive way. It's going to affect the quality of the relationship with children. This is going to result in more negative discipline, more spanking, more yelling, but it's also going to create more stress in the relationship. It's going to create more distance. It's going to create more silence, and it's going to create more unpredictability. And this is what children don't need. And then what we know and what our data clearly shows is that also caregiver mental health problems are associated with worse child development. What you can see here is that caregivers who are at the bottom quintiles of the mental health distribution, their children are going to have differences and gaps with those that are not affected, that are among half to one standard deviation, which are very large effects. And in more like econometric terms, what we're finding is that caregiver mental health is actually explaining a large share of the effect of conflict on early child development. And this again highlights this intergenerational transmission of trauma and poverty. So I think, and let me skip this for the sake of time. As Felipe was mentioning, back in 2014, back in 2013, many of us were inspired and motivated and hopeful about the peace process. And many of us thought, well, we need to come back to Colombia and try to contribute through different ways. And our way was to think about, can we break this cycle of trauma and poverty among these families? And so we created this program called Semillas de Apego, Seeds for Better Attachment. As economists, we didn't want to go and design our program by ourselves, so we started a collaboration with the Child Parent Psychotherapy program in the University of California, San Francisco. This is a program led by Alicia Lieberman, kind of a giant in the field of attachment. This is a clinical program, very intensive, developed for Latino and Afro-American communities in California. And so we took this as a starting point for a program, and then we started adapting over time to make it more feasible for implementation in Colombia, but also more sensitive to the characteristics and needs of displaced populations here. The program is a community-based psychosocial model. It runs through 15 sessions for caregivers to young children. This can be a mother, this can be a father, this can be a grandmother. Most of the time, because of gender norms and so on, our participants are the mothers. And it follows not an instructive approach as many other like CBT programs, but instead a reflexive approach that tries to promote emotional awareness and emotional regulation. And it's led by the community. It's led by non-professionals, community facilitators, some of them victims themselves, some of them actual participants of the program. So the program tackles three main dimensions. First, we try to promote mental health. And here we try to help caregivers understand their mental health, overcome stigma about mental health, recognize that the mental health consequences and their mental health symptoms that they're going through are normal reactions to very abnormal circumstances and dramatic circumstances. And through this, we create emotional awareness that allows them to reframe these experiences, to connect and better connect with their emotions, and to understand and come with self-regulation practices. Then this kind of opens the space and the bandwidth and the emotional bandwidth to understand what's happening with their child, understand that children also have very complex emotions, that they're also responding to what's happening outside of the family because of conflict, displacement, and so on, but that they're also responding to the stress that the caregiver is going through. And so this also creates a space to promoting more sensitive parenting and healthy attachments. And with this should lead into better early child development. And also the program tries to tackle community agency. Agency is not, and specifically in these settings, it's not an individual dimension, it's a community dimension. And we want to promote parenting teams, we want to promote support networks. I want to just highlight the importance of community model. It is embedded within the task shifting dimensions to overcome deficits in mental health services, but it also allows us to understand, recognize, and adapt the program to the participants' lived experiences. And it also builds this horizontal relationships between facilitators and participants. Facilitators are just the same, and they have led through the same experiences as participants. And participants that can recognize themselves within the facilitators, recognize that they're going through the same type of hardships, and recognize that hope and change is possible. Just let me highlight, back in 2018 and 2020, we ran our first RCT, our first randomized control experiment in Tumaco, a gorgeous municipality in Colombia, also very affected by conflict. We worked with a sample of almost 1,400 caregivers. More than half of them had been displaced. More than 80% of them had been victims of violence. 40% had at-risk mental health symptoms. And 8 months after the program ended, we see large reductions in symptoms of mental health problems. For instance, a 46% reduction in at-risk symptoms of caregiver anxiety and sensitivity. We also see reductions in the stress that's happening in the family and in the parental relationships. So a big 38% reduction. And we also see that children are being benefiting from this in a large way, both in their mental health and both in their emotional and socio-emotional development. So this took us from creating a program that we thought was kind of an academic endeavor, that we wanted to contribute to the peace process by ourselves, to identify a program that could break some of these cycles. And then over time, this has been a magical experience of growing up and scaling. We're now in 12 municipalities of Colombia. We work with 52 community facilitators. We've reached almost 10,000 caregivers and almost 16,000 children. And there's kind of many questions and many, I think, hard truths. One is mental health remains deprioritized in conflict-affected settings, especially for caregivers. Colombia spends very little of its health budget on mental health. We keep expecting caregivers to become the source of protection for the children under extreme stress and vulnerability. We keep underinvesting in early childhood and emergencies. And what we're showing is that this doesn't have to be. One, because the consequences of neglecting mental health, the consequences of neglecting early childhood are profoundly negative for families, for the individuals, but for society itself. It's gonna set the seed for this intergenerational transmission of poverty, of trauma, future conflict. And we've shown that we can actually tackle these issues through a unified lens within a 15-week program. But still, there are questions in how do we take this to scale? How do we make this sustainable, especially under the current environment of funding cuts? And how do we grow this and scale it up so that we can reach the needs that we're seeing in the field? So that's it for us. Thank you so much, and happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Andrés, and thank you so much, Felipe. So I want to thank you for sharing these spectacular projects with us, making sure that audiences internationally know that these programs are going on, that given these not only budgeting cuts in the United States that affected heavily Colombia as other countries in the world, but now that we have also very little support in Colombia to do science, as Felipe pointed out with the data, it's crucial that we can get also supporters and maybe collaborations across countries that we can use to bring in more funds to do this together. And thank you so much for you and your teams for sharing. So now I'm going to give path for Evan again, so we can catch up on our agenda.
Thanks, Andres.
Thank you so much, guys.